Caves are a pretty well-known feature in the Pikmin series. Usually you explore wide, open areas under a time limit, but when you enter a cave, you instead face a series of smaller sublevels. With time not really being the focus, instead it's more on managing your Pikmin and making sure they don't die. Caves are a pretty big part of Pikmin 4, however they were introduced and are most commonly associated with Pikmin 2. Why would people primarily think of Pikmin 2 when they hear about caves? I have no clue at all. I've already ranked every cave in Pikmin 2, but it's been heavily suggested by my audience that I rank them all in Pikmin 4 as well. And considering the last cave ranking was like, I don't know, I've been doing this Pikmin YouTube thing for like 5 weeks, maybe 2 years. Considering that, and also the fact that Pikmin 4 got an update that made the game more difficult, which led me to change my mind on several caves, I think now is the time for the highly suggested Pikmin 4 cave ranking. In this video, we will be ranking every cave in Pikmin 4. Not much else to say, really. Now, there are several types of caves in this game, but for the purposes of this video, we are only looking at the caves with blue lids, since they follow the usual cave formula. Other caves do different styles of gameplay, like missions and Dandori battles, so they're not really what we're looking for. In total, we'll be looking through 22 caves. This will be from the perspective of playing on the Fierce difficulty, as I feel it's the ideal way to play, and I don't think it's news to anyone that pre-update Pikmin 4's gameplay is... yeah. So I'm judging it based on Fierce mode as it represents the caves a lot better. Be sure to subscribe for high quality Pikmin videos weekly, or else I'll close all of the caves. Alright, so starting off, we have a cave that didn't even get the honor of joining the list properly, and that is the Burrow of Beginnings. The only reason I'm talking about it is because it technically meets the qualifications, and also because I know at least one person would be getting upset that I didn't include it in the video. So I just thought I'd mention it now and immediately disqualify us. This cave is the only one in the hub world, and you go through it during the day 1 tutorial. Naturally, you may be thinking that this is the tutorial to caves, but it's really just a cave that shows up in the tutorial. You don't learn about the mechanics of the caves here or how they work, you don't even have the pickable men yet. So it just kinda serves as a glorified fuss pass. Apart from some vases and the nefarious boys who bumble around a branch, there's nothing going on here gameplay-wise, which is why it isn't part of the list. And even if I was including it, it would be straight at the bottom for pretty obvious reasons. It's not really a cave, and it's not even a good part of the tutorial either. You don't learn anything, it just adds 2 more loading screens to an already bloated tutorial. You can just skip it now, so there's not much point in getting in a big hissy fit over it anymore, but overall it's a pretty meaningless addition to the game. While I'm here, I might as well bring up the tree type Limus.
Oh shit, here we go again.
You're probably aware that this was one of the game's biggest fumbles. It dragged down the level design and completely eradicated most of the squad strategy by just essentially forcing you to only use the Pikmin that are strictly necessary for an area or cave, which is pretty antithetical to the rest of the series. It makes the squad planning more in line with Hey Pikmin than an actual Pikmin game. It's such a consistent problem throughout the game that it just ends up being a net negative for all of these caves, and to avoid sounding like a broken record for the entire video, I'll just say here that it's bad and affects every single one of these caves to some extent. I mean, I could bring up every individual example of when it hurts a cave, but then the video would be like half an hour longer, and it's honestly more of a game problem than a problem with any specific caves. If you watch my video on Pikmin 4, you already know I think the caves are pretty weak, and this was definitely a very big contributor to why that is, so just let that be known. There were actually a few contenders for last place, and it was pretty close, but I eventually settled on the rather unconventional choice of the ultimate testing range. You were probably expecting one of the early game tutorial caves to be here and not a post-game cave that shows up in the 5th area. And what I say to that is when I played this cave, I was expecting a post-game cave from the 5th area and not an early game tutorial cave. It seems like an odd choice, but there are several layers to why I'm not very fond of this one. To start off small, theming wise, it's not really that interesting. It's a metal cave, but at this point you would have already gone through 3 full metal caves, not even including the Doppelganger's Den, which has half of its sublevels in the metal theming, so at this point in the game the metal theming just kind of feels tired at this point and isn't very unique. With the exception of the Dweevils, a lot of the enemies here also don't really make much sense being here. Like, why is Squidly Diddly hanging out on this completely dry metal floor? Shouldn't you be near the ocean? Obviously the enemies not matching the aesthetics of the cave is a bit of a nitpick, and it wouldn't really matter that much if the enemy layouts were well thought out. Take a wild guess what I'm about to say next. The enemy layouts are really dry here and mostly consist of very weak enemies. In fact, most of the enemies are harmless or bordering on harmless. And they're usually the enemies you'd see alongside other stronger enemies on a floor, but there are no stronger enemies here. It leads to a very frictionless experience, and this cave would feel out of place in like the 3rd area, let alone the 5th. You may be thinking this could potentially be rectified by splitting up with Ochi. You could take on 2 sides of the floor at once, and since the enemies are so weak, you wouldn't lose too much from being apart from him anyways because his strength doesn't matter that much. However, this just can't really happen. Most of the floors are really linear, having you move in just one direction, so there's no other paths to go, hence no reason to split up. And for the 2 floors that aren't linear, sublevel 2 is absolutely littered with poles, meaning Ochi can't do anything on his own, and half of sublevel 4 is completely optional since there's nothing to collect over there, so it might as well just be a linear path. Sublevel 4 also just consists entirely of dweevils and jelly floats. Really? This cave is insultingly easy even by this game's standards, and it is not a good thing at all. The cave is just really boring to get through, and it doesn't bring anything new to the table. The enemy layouts are so bad, in fact, that Fierce Mode doesn't even really make a difference. Since these are just really weak enemies, it doesn't matter that much if they have more health. This is also one of the few caves that makes you use winged Pikmin, and they have 2 floors where they attempt to create this sort of dilemma, where you can either build a bridge or use winged Pikmin. But by the time you reach the actual bridges and figure out this dilemma exists, the floor is over. The cave has flying platforms over large gaps, conveyor belts, and treasures Pikmin that can't fly won't be able to reach, and the absolute mindfuck of figuring out you should use winged Pikmin to carry stuff is about the peak of the challenge for this cave. You just do very basic stuff with the winged Pikmin, which really helps make the cave feel like a tutorial one that somehow snuck its way into the post-game. In the post-game, the caves get cut back on. There's only 3 in each area, and the sub-level counts can be weirdly small, often to their own detriment. So for one of the actually longer caves here to be this easy and this boring just feels like a complete squander. It'd still be bad enough earlier in the game, but the point in which it actually shows up in is just utterly inexcusable. With the man at legs being the boss of the cave and the name being a direct reference to a Pikmin 2 challenge mode level, it's clear they're pulling inspiration from that level and also the Subterranean complex. But I have no clue why, since most of that cave's standout enemies are entirely absent from Pikmin 4 with no substitutes. If they actually are in Pikmin 4 or do have appropriate substitutes in Pikmin 4, they just don't show up. Pikmin 4 already shows that explosions from enemies can be used for some rather interesting things that couldn't happen in Pikmin 2, like breaking down structures quickly, and having a hazard that can easily wipe out your squad would encourage you not to just ride Ochi for once. It would be a good diversion. But, alas, none of this actually happens in this cave. It's not like we were even starved for metal caves either. This is the 4th one. Honestly, the entire cave just feels like an excuse to have the man at legs show up. Speaking of which, the highlight floor for this one is sublevel 5, since the man at legs looks cool, though the actual fight itself is not doing this cave any favors. Running back and forth out of a trench simulator in Pikmin 2 was already kind of pushing us, but holding left on the joystick simulator is just crossing that line completely. Overall, this cave just fails in all frontiers. There's barely any redeeming qualities to this one. The Aquifer summit was very close to getting last place. There isn't really anything here to complain about, probably because there's nothing here. So this is the final cave in the Sun-Speckled Terrace, and after going through 4 other caves, you'd naturally expect this one to be the most difficult in the area. But no, it's actually the easiest cave in the entire game. There is no end of cave boss fight, which is weird considering it's the final cave here, but forget about that, there aren't even enemies. No Bulborbs, no Blowhogs, no nefarious boys who bumble around a branch, nothing. It consists of 2 floors. The first one lasts about as long as a YouTube ad and does basically nothing except handing you 15 ice Pikmin. The second one is a little better, but there still isn't too much going on aside from a few firestones and the mildest of multitasking with the sculpture. There aren't even really any puzzles, so it mostly just consists of you walking around and doing menial tasks. It's a very underwhelming final cave despite having a big lead up with this giant hill, and even by first area standards, no, this isn't a good cave at all. It's just an actual nothing burger, and the game would probably be better off if it got removed or heavily reworked. You can make the argument that it's an early game cave so it has to be simple, but this is just too simple, especially because you've done 4 other caves at this point, and this one is by far the worst out of the bunch. It doesn't even make sense for this one to be 2 sublevels long and have nothing in it, because in the next area, one of the first caves you can access, and was the first cave I did on my first playthrough, has 3 times the amount of sublevels and a total of 3 boss fights in it. How is this just not a completely nonsensical jump in progression? This isn't easing new players into caves, it's just sheltering them from them. I can't cut it any slack either because it's the 5th cave. If you're replaying the game and have to go through what is essentially 5 tutorial caves in a row, it gets old pretty quick. Tutorial cave isn't even really applicable to this one since there's nothing being taught or introduced here. You've seen every element in this cave before this, often in more interesting layouts too. It doesn't even combine these elements into an interesting challenge. I'm at a loss for finding a single point to why this cave should even exist. The highlight floor for this one is sublevel 2 because it lasts longer than 12 seconds. Overall though, it's a poorly designed and rather pointless addition to the game. If I had a knuckle for every cave in the Sun-Speckled Terrace that had 2 sublevels and featured 0 hostile enemies, I wouldn't be able to use my hands anymore since I somehow wrote knuckle instead of nickel in the script.
Oh,
Yep, the Industrial Maze is another cave with 0 enemies, bar the Honey Wisp, but come on. It is definitely better than the Aquifer Summit. Sublevel 1 has you split up from Ochi. That's helpful for new players to learn how to split up, but that's all I can really give this cave because yet again, nothing really happens here. It could be a tutorial for yellow Pikmin. You witness their throw heist, the fact they're immune to electricity, and that they dig faster, and that'd be all well and good, but you already do a cave before this which introduces you to yellow Pikmin for the first time, does all of that, while also having stuff going on. This is yet again walking around and doing menial tasks. It doesn't feel like Pikmin, it feels like I'm in an empty Among Us server. Sublevel 1 is the highlight floor, said highlight being a broken lamp. I like that you split up forces, and it does give it a slight edge over the Aquifer Summit, but just like that cave, this one feels like complete filler, which is not what content that's like an hour into the game should feel like. Be honest, before I mentioned this cave, did you remember that the Drafty Gallery existed? This is probably the most forgettable cave in not just this game, but probably the Pikmin series. I can remember most of the caves in Pikmin 3 better. I don't even mean that as in I found it forgettable. No, literally not a single person ever talks about this cave, and if you try to look for anybody talking about it anywhere, all you will find is fucking cobwebs. It's really easy to see why this cave is forgettable. Not only is every floor just extremely dry with there being 0 friction or much challenge, but this cave brings nothing new to the table, and that's not even hyperbole. It introduces nothing new. You've seen all these enemies before this, you've seen all these obstacles before this, and even the theme isn't unique. It doesn't even do anything unique or noteworthy with these pre-existing elements, it's just so standard. This is kind of an issue with every metal cave in this game, and we saw it in the ultimate testing range, but none of the enemies getting used particularly fit the metal team all too well. You kinda take this for granted since they usually do it so well, but the enemies always feel like they fit and could live where the environment is. So it kinda stands out here when everything feels a bit out of place, like it's a fan-made cave created in a level editor. It's in the same spot as the ultimate testing range, where not only do the enemies not fit the theming, but they also just aren't used in interesting ways. I usually don't even mind or particularly notice when enemy layouts don't match the theme, since on the rare occasions when this happens, the layouts are engaging enough for you not to pay much notice, and breaking the theming feels like a worthy sacrifice for a well thought out level design. Here though, the enemies that don't match with the theme also don't really provide much for the cave. The very nature of caves means that the enemies will be providing most of the gameplay and the challenges within that cave. Most good sublevels end up feeling like, and basically are, an extension of the enemies that are in them. If the enemies in a sublevel end up feeling like an afterthought, something has gone wrong. They're also all quarantined from each other too, as if the coronavirus is mucking about. Pretty consistent problem throughout this game actually, but it's very noticeable here, since a Joustmite all on its lonesome is not providing much for the cave. Another thing with this cave is that as seen with the Industrial Maze, the game heavily encourages you to split up from Ochi. You know, #DanDory. Then you get to this cave, and if you dare to split up from Ochi, the game just goes, "Oh sorry, we don't do any of that multitasking nonsense around here. Pikmin tree is down the hall and to the left." It's a common occurrence throughout this game, but the second area is definitely the worst place for this to be occurring in, because you immediately get penalized for trying to split up the captains after the game literally told you to do that. It's sloppy and hazardous level design that is sending a bad message to new players and is completely contrarian to what the game urges you to do. Not to mention, these roadblocks also never add anything to the level. This could be a ramp and nothing would change, except you could safely split up with your captains. Now, I said that this cave doesn't introduce anything new, and that was a slight exaggeration. There is actually one boss here that is unique, and it does actually stick out in my mind. And based off of what I said, you're probably expecting something even moderately exciting, but no, the only reason I remember it is because it's one of the stupidest things I've ever seen in a Pikmin game. After 3 boring and uninspired floors, you finally reach a boss floor. And the boss fight is a puffy blowhog. Genuinely, what are we doing? The puffy blowhog as a boss, you know, the enemy that has always been functionally harmless, only being able to blow Pikmin over with wind. It's so weak, in fact, in basically every prior game, it's put alongside other enemies because it served little purpose on its own. But in this game, this is apparently an enemy worthy of not only being on its own, but also being a boss fight that you see at the end of a cave. This has got to be one of the most patronizing games I've ever played. It genuinely thinks you're too much of an incompetent fool to handle an actual boss fight, so it throws you this lazy excuse for one instead. There isn't even a fight, you just throw ice Pikmin at it and it falls to the ground and shatters into pieces. In what world is this just not insulting to the player? This isn't a boss fight, it's a part-time janitor fight at most. Even for boss encounters as underwhelming and poorly tuned as the Emperor Bullblacks in Pikmin 2, some attempt was at least made. They did not just slop some random enemy from the Piccolopedia into an arena and expect you to be impressed. I know I'm having a back credit card moment over this sublevel, but aside from that, there's nothing to really talk about here. I'd say the highlight floor for me is probably sublevel 3, since the concept of you using a geyser to get to the main part of the floor, along with building a bridge to the entrance of the next sublevel is kinda cool, but that's about it. Everything else here is just standard to the point of being boring. It's a shame too, because this setup on sublevel 3 is probably one of the only actually interesting things in this cave, and even then it's not really explored, despite the idea of having sublevels split off and needing to use a geyser to reach certain halves of them being a very compelling concept. Probably enough to be the basis of a cave. It also suits this game's desire to have you multitask too. You could split off from Ochi and the captain to tackle 2 halves of each floor. Maybe you could even have a floor where Ochi and the captain get split up, just like the first floor of the industrial maze, and you have to find a way to reunite them. Sublevel 3, which is the penultimate floor before an interpretation of a boss fight, actually feels like it'd be the first floor of a cave that warms you into this concept. It feels like this should have been the basis for the cave, but instead we got a cave that doesn't even really have a basis, and ends up feeling really half-baked. Sublevel 2 consists of 2 fire geysers and 2 fiery blowhogs. The challenge here is figuring out that the square shape goes into the square hole. One of the tutorial caves that mostly introduces you to fire has more engaging layouts that utilize the hazard better. Tutorial caves have more going on than this one. The cave just has no identity of its own. It's no wonder why everybody forgets about this one. You could pass someone a modded copy of this game with this cave completely removed, and 99% of players probably won't even notice. Sure, it is a cave in the second area, which is early in the game, but I'm not letting that excuse it when all other caves in the second area, and a tutorial one in the first area somehow, is substantially more interesting and engaging than this one is. I would say it deserves the reputation of being completely forgotten about, but the sheer audacity of having a puffy blowhog being a boss fight means the only thing this cave deserves is to be paraded through the streets and ridiculed. That alongside the other lackluster floor layouts made me seriously consider putting this one in last. It's another cave with barely anything positive to say about it and has absolutely nothing in the way of actually creative level design.
You're not an ordinary fella!
Waiter, more sun-speckled sludge, please. The Hectic Hollows. With a name like that, I'd expect some utter shenanigans, but no, it's actually quite tame. About as hectic as tying someone's shoes together. It's another 2-floor sublevel, but unlike the previous 2 in the sun-speckled deterrence, it at least serves a purpose and doesn't ultimately feel useless. You get introduced to Ice Pikmin's central mechanic, which is freezing water, building structures, and also a bit of splitting off from Ochi. It's also the first cave you'll likely enter when you have a big Ochi, so I can be a bit more lenient towards it being simple. That being said, it's still a bit too simple for my liking, and this cave does not hold up all too well for replays. Sublevel 1 is fast paced and perfectly fine, but then sublevel 2 is... Yep, that's it. I do appreciate that this is a good hidden tutorial for how Ochi's rush works when he's grown. There's vases here that you already know need to be smashed with Ochi's rush, a slight gap here so you'll be riding him since you need to jump over it, and then when you go to smash the vases you get an immediate example of how the rush works against enemies. That is pretty splendid tutorial design, but also you can still have this and also put other stuff on the floor, because once you've learned what you need to learn from that hidden tutorial, this floor is just really lame. In fact, it's pretty lame on your first time around too. I think they should have just gutted the Aquifer Summit and Industrial Maze and just given this cave 5 floors with probably a boss at the end, because that'd basically be the same amount of content but with a lot more opportunities to make a fully coherent and fleshed out cave. I'd call it serviceable on a good day, and it's at least better than its peers, but I don't really think it's a good cave. Even on your first playthrough, it's underwhelming.
We're here for so much.
Louis.
It's a crime.
The Dream Home is another pretty forgettable one. It kind of initially wriggled its way high enough into the ranking list when I was planning this video, but then I actually properly remembered this and was like, oh yeah, I don't really fuck with you at all. Bar the tutorial cave, this is one of 2 single sublevel caves, and I feel like this one is just way weaker than the other one, that being the Sightless Passage. The Sightless Passage had a very continuous flow, which really did make it feel like a change of pace compared to the other caves, whereas the flow of the Dream Home feels really stilted. There's an abundance of treasures here, and getting all of them is super simple, to the point where the floor kind of feels bloated. Most of the floor is dedicated to this kind of obnoxious section, which I just don't really like. You need to split up with Ochi here and reunite them with the captain, but it can just feel clunky. Purples, which the game recommends, can't reach the bouncy mushroom for whatever reason, and then you have to throw yellows onto this grace while avoiding a snoot whacker, which is just pretty irritating as this game doesn't have that many crowd control options. The enemy layout is also kinda whatever. There's a cool section here with the jumbo bullboard, but then the rest is just small enemies that get absolutely flattened by purple Pikmin. Also the snoot whackers, I don't like them. The gimmick is that you need to use an Ochi rush to expose their weak points and kill them, something you haven't been doing to any other enemy at all. I don't exactly mind these small ones, it's the mammoth snoot whacker who I have a particular distaste towards, who just so happens to be the boss of this cave. It's literally just the exact same enemy, but it's bigger and takes much longer to kill with a large portion of downtime spent with you just waiting around. It's just such a boring boss fight. It's harmless, so there are no stakes, and it's not even a unique design visually. Or well, I thought it was harmless, but it can crush Pikmin if you dawdle around it doing nothing for long enough. The fact I only learned about this now, almost 3 years after the game came out, lets you know how much of an active threat this guy poses. I think this fight just makes the cave actively worse. A boss fight being a dud usually isn't the end of the world for a cave, but due to how short this cave is, it naturally affects the cave a lot more. It's not even just that it's a lame fight, it's an actively unfun and boring fight. Now, something actually really cool about this cave is that the safe from the hero's hideaway and the combination code needed to unlock it are repurposed here, and this definitely gives the cave some identity. In fact, I prefer how the safe is used here than in the hideaway. Pretty cool, and I do like the setup and payoff of Louis using it to hide a big snack in there. It's a funny bit and one of the few instances of Louis not having groan-worthy writing in story mode. I just wish the actual stuff around this safe was more engaging, because I do definitely see the vision for this cave, I just thought the execution was rather weak. Finally, another thing that I think makes it less effective is that not only is it underwhelming for the 5th area, but what made the Sightless Passage also work was it was next to 3 other caves, all of which were 4 or more sublevels. So the different pacing felt like a contrast and a nice change of pace. Here though, this cave is next to only 2 other caves, which aren't particularly long or that difficult, so it just ends up feeling like a bit of a squander. Overall, not the worst this game has to offer, and it does have a neat concept, but it's generally not a particularly enjoyable experience.
Cold journey to school this morning.
Oh, good, you wouldn't belong getting frostbite.
The Last Frost Cavern. So this is the actual tutorial cave. The rubbish footpath we saw earlier didn't really meet the qualifications for that. It does its job well. This is a single floor cave and it introduces basically everything you need to know about the caves in a very timely manner and doesn't wear out its welcome. You also get introduced to ice Pikmin here, and you get the general gist on how they operate. This game can actually have some rock-solid tutorial design as showcased by this cave and that previous encounter in the Hectic Hollows, and it's frankly disappointing that they decided to shit all over it by introducing one of the worst and most bloated tutorial sequences in any game ever, along with the non-stop interruptions and dialogue that pop up on screen. They should have just let the actually well-designed and sold tutorial segments speak for themselves and not have Colin speak over them. It is ultimately a tutorial cave, not having a super complicated layout, which is why it's ranked low, but honestly I'm pretty fond of this, and I never mind playing through this one again. Unlike the Emergence cave, which was something I kinda just begrudgingly tolerated under the basis of it being a tutorial. This is an actually fun enough cave, and even with a simple enough layout, it has more going on than some of the other ones we've seen. And it makes a lot more sense for the very first cave you encounter to be simple. This one does a good job of being a tutorial while wrapping itself up quickly and still having interesting enough gameplay for repeat playthroughs.
Finally, some good fucking food.
The Crackling cauldron is definitely a diamond in the rough compared to a lot of the caves at the lower end of this list. It's definitely the best out of the ones featured in the Sun-Speckled Terrace, and while those caves suffered from being far too simple, this one actually has the weird issue of being too complicated for the point in the game it shows up in, which if you've played it probably sounds like complete drivel, so let me explain. This cave is your first introduction to a lot of fire elements and also yellow Pikmin, and it very seamlessly introduces you to a lot of these aspects in a very timely manner. The layouts are simple but appropriate for this part of the game while still having actually interesting gameplay going on. Sublevel 2 is definitely the highlight floor. One aspect I like of it is all of these branching paths. These can spice up the floor for replays. It's a simple cave but it has a good flow and is fun to blast through. Now what makes this cave weird is this is one of the very few caves you'll be doing before Ochi becomes a big guy. So you can split up from him unless you actively go out of your way to play through this cave after Ochi has grown, which is not optimal for a playthrough. The reason I bring this up is because the layout of this cave, specifically sublevel 2, actually suits the two-captain system better than a good majority of the sublevels in this game, and is a standout example of the untapped potential splitting up what Ochi has when you aren't getting hit with roadblocks every 5 seconds. Being able to split up with Ochi and tackle 2 halves of the floor at once gives this floor a very good skill ceiling, and is extremely engaging to do and pull off. It goes from a good floor to a pretty masterfully designed one by early game standards. And not just for this game, for the series in general. Unfortunately though, as I said, you're meant to play through this cave with small Ochi, and going out of your way to enter it with a grown Ochi is unoptimal. So seeing this cave at its best is actually a top secret Easter egg. I don't get why they didn't just put this cave somewhere where you could only access it once you have a big Ochi. It utilizes him better than the tree caves in this area that actually are accessed once he's big. Overall, this cave is good actually. It's ranked lower because naturally being an early game cave, it has a simpler layout, which is fine. I'm pretty fond of this one. It felt like it had a cohesive design behind it, whereas a lot of the other caves in the Sun-Speckled Terrace felt like they were made after the designer's boss said they couldn't join a union. In fact, if this cave was placed in a spot where you had big Ochi, I probably would have bumped it a spot higher.
So I said, oh, I've come to have a dance, and like, oh, not tonight, come back tomorrow. I never went back.
The below grade discotheque. The highlight floor for this one is obviously sublevel 5, where you get to fight the groovy Longlegs. Probably one of the best boss encounters in this game. Great design, and it's also a fun fight with a fun gimmick. It's no wonder he was used so much for advertising this game, along with becoming one of the series' most iconic enemies. With a boss this cool, the rest of the cave has to be an absolute blast, right?
Well,
despite how fun the groovy Longlegs is, it pains me to say that the prior 4 floors before this are just extremely forgettable, and suffers a lot of the same issues with the metallic caves we've seen prior. The groovy Longlegs is the extremely cool party, whereas these 4 floors are the hangover the next morning. I do think this is at least better than most of the other metal caves, but again, nothing unique is really being introduced or done in them, and they feel rather frictionless. None of the enemies really feel like they fit with the metal theming or add too much to the cave, an issue with all of these metal caves somehow. There are enemies that already exist in this game, most of which are actually severely underused that suit the metal theming, such as the Anode Beetle. The Anode Beetle is only used twice in the entire game and was used in metal floors prior to 4, since it was a natural fit. Despite how little it's used in the game and how it definitely could have benefited from being used in some interesting floor layouts, not a single one of these metal caves feature them. Instead, they do far more interesting things, like spamming John Pork all over sublevel 1. Why have 4 separate metal caves if none of them are going to be using the theming to its fullest potential? Speaking of theming and potential, I'm gonna grill this cave extra hard on the theming since we have the groovy long legs and the cave is literally titled the below grade discotheque. There is so much potential here. Imagine if they went through with the disco theming for the whole cave. That would be amazing and could be one of the most memorable caves in the entire series, purely from spectacle alone. The sky's the limit with what you could do with stuff like that, so why oh why are we just doing boring metal slop that's already used way too much in this game and has 3 separate caves dedicated to it already? They had a home run with the theming here and then they just did this to us. Also, music-wise, an issue that plagues every single cave in this game is that they just repeat this one ambience track for like every single sub-level. And I do mean almost every single sub-level, I'm not being hyperbolic here. This is already annoying, and it's especially bad here. I don't think I have to explain why. The quiet sadness of the below-grade discotheque. The cave just feels like wasted potential. It had the blueprint to be a truly grace and memorable cave, but bar the groovy long legs, I and many others just end up completely forgetting about it, and it's not hard to see why. You also get winged Pikmin here for the first time, but they're just here so you have them. They don't do anything in this cave. I was writing the script and then I realized winged Pikmin actually aren't useless here since the devs actually put in a really cool shortcut on sublevel 4. You usually have to build up a valve to extinguish this fire floor, which no Pikmin, not even reds, can pass, but if you utilize your game knowledge you can get all 10 of the winged Pikmin in this cave and completely skip building this structure, saving you both resources and time.
What the fuck?
So there's this entire shortcut designed for winged Pikmin, but it just doesn't even work. Like, I was trying to give this game some praise. That's just egregious. What do you mean I thought more in depth about the level layout than the people who made it? So yeah, the winged Pikmin actually are useless. It's blatantly obvious the only reason they're here is because you wouldn't see them until the 5th area and you'd be entering caves intended for winged Pikmin with no winged Pikmin, along with having them in minuscule numbers, or well, even more minuscule numbers. They were probably just shoehorned into this cave to try and patch that up, since they clearly aren't designed with this cave in mind. There's a few instances of this in the game actually, but they usually attempt to mask it somewhat, and they at least add a bit to the cave, even if it was often a poor introduction to that Pikmin. Here though, all the winged Pikmin do is make you notice how little cohesion is behind the Pikmin types in this game. There's also sublevel 3, which is just weird. It's a conveyor belt puzzle, and the puzzle, while being alright, is basically all there is to this floor gameplay-wise, aside from 2 really easy to nab trinkets. It's strange because that's not usually how puzzles are implemented in this game, or the rest of the series. You usually see them alongside gameplay segments, but here the puzzle is basically all of the gameplay for this floor. This creates the issue of once you've figured it out once, this floor has basically nothing to offer you once you replay it. It's not even that fun your first time around because it is so visually cluttered. Most of the stuff on screen has no relation to the puzzle. If you strip it to its basics, it definitely could have been slotted onto a normal floor and it would have been better that way. Since as it stands, this floor doesn't even really have Pikmin gameplay, it's an odd misfit. I know I've been tearing this cave a new hole this entire time, but at least compared to the other metal caves, the floors always have at least one interesting element. But still, not really the most engaging cave. At least you have the groovy long legs to look forward to while playing it. He basically carries this cave. And he himself is being carried by Fierce Mode since his fight doesn't get off the ground at all if you're on the normal difficulty. This cave could have been so much more, but it's overall a pretty big disappointment. At least the name of the cave was right about one thing. The Subzero sauna is another pretty forgettable cave, and the main reason it's forgettable is that it blends in pretty well with another cave, the Frozen Inferno. I don't even mean it in like these caves look alike visually, no, they utilize the same theme, same gimmicks, very similar enemies, and sometimes use the same concepts too, such as needing to unfreeze a pool of water to access a button to lower iron grates. Even the names are riffing on the same concept. They're identical and also really close together, only being an area apart from each other, and I feel like this kinda drags them both down. The Subzero sauna is only 3 sublevels long, so it doesn't feel like it gets off the ground. And then the Frozen Inferno ends up feeling like rehashed and repetitive content since you've already gone through some near identical floors in another cave. My main stance on this cave is it should have just been gutted and its floors should have been put into the Frozen Inferno. That being said, all 3 floors here are solid and fun to go through. The highlight floor for me is sublevel 2. I like how you have to unfreeze the water by finding all of the ice cubes. It's a neat mechanic, and the ice cubes give you something to look for in this cave aside from treasure. And the fact that they stall non-ice Pikmin, while technically a nuisance, it does give you more incentive to actually deal with them. It's like a refined version of tripping from Pikmin 1. The Arctic Cannonbeal is also a fun enough boss, even if it is pretty simple. You get white Pikmin here who, just like the wing Pikmin in the below grade discotheque, feel pretty shoehorned in though to a slightly lesser degree. There are a whopping 2 poison geysers in the entire cave, so they aren't technically pointless. But they don't add much to the cave, and it's not really a good introduction to them. Yet again, just feels like they got to a post-game area while testing and went,
"No crackers, Gromit! We've forgotten the crackers!"
Overall, this cave is pretty fun, but it is short and doesn't really get off the ground. Definitely would have been better off if it was cut and repurposed into the Frozen Inferno, since that cave is also pretty short and could do with some more meat.
So why don't you split? Looks like I already did. You're the sad figment of my twisted psyche's tragic dividend.
The Doppelganger's Den is another pretty middle-of-the-road cave, and another one I see potential in, but it just ended up feeling a little underwhelming. It's another cave with pretty weak theming. In fact, I'd say this cave has probably the weakest theming out of them all. The first half of this cave is tile, which not only is pretty jarring when you actually enter the cave, because it is just completely mismatched with its location, but it also just doesn't feel unique because it's wedged between 2 caves with the exact same theme. The other half of the cave is metal, which I think you've gotten the memo at this point. However, something to note is, unlike most other metal floors, these ones actually work. The enemies all fit with the theme, and there's elements of these floors that feel uniquely metallic. And it actually uses elements such as the conveyor belts in very interesting ways. Actually, out of all the caves, this one should have been the metal one. The main enemy the cave is built around fits in with the metal theming, plus even in the tile floors at the start of the cave, there's elements that feel like they are for a metal cave. These barriers that open and close just look obtuse in the tile theming, but would fit perfectly for a metal cave. It's just a shame they beat the metal theme to death with caves it wasn't even really suited for, because this cave definitely should have been the metal cave, probably the only metal cave in fact. I know complaining about the theming seems like a nitpick, but it really isn't for this cave. The cave just doesn't feel unique, and I'm never exactly excited to go through it, even if I usually enjoy myself when I actually do play through it. The first 2 floors having pretty milquetoast layouts don't exactly help matters either. The highlight floor for me would definitely have to be sublevel 3. Tons of elements are here and you go through them at a fairly rapid pace, fused with pretty interesting enemy layouts to boot. This floor is actually great and shows the potential the metal floors in this game could have had. This is where the cave truly gets off the ground, but it gets back on the ground immediately because the next floor is the final one, capping off the cave at a pretty short 4 sublevels. I feel like the cave ended a bit too soon and wasn't able to reach its fullest potential. It'd be a shame if the game did that to basically every other cave I feel positive about. The boss of this cave, the Gritty Mander, is a fun fight and is definitely one of the best out of Pikmin 4's boss roster. Overall, similar to the below-grade discotheque, this felt like a cave that had a lot of potential to be a truly great cave, yet it just didn't really get there. And honestly, I think the abundance of weaker metal caves is probably to blame for this. This cave really did feel like it was intended to be a metal cave, but they probably dialed back on it because of how much the metal theming shows up. Which is a shame because this is definitely the best out of the metal caves.
Though it isn't.
The Plunder Palace is actually kind of a weird one. Fierce mode has usually elevated my opinion of the caves in this game, but this is kind of a rare instance where I think Fierce mode has actually soured my opinion on a cave. The breadbugs are the central gimmick here, and back in the Dark Ages, where every enemy lasted about as long as a little European child named Rufus during the outburst of the bubonic plague, seeing a breadbug who needed to be dealt with slightly differently and not by caving its skull in with an Ochi rush felt like a breath of fresh air for me when going through this one. However, since Fierce mode does significantly impact the enemies and rushing them with Ochi isn't always just a win button, this cave doesn't really hold up all too well now. I wouldn't call it bad, in fact it's still enjoyable to go through, but the enemy layouts are fairly weak, with most enemies not posing too much of a threat and are generally kinda mindless. It's not all bad though, there is a pretty unique mid-boss encounter with the Proquillin. It's a good twist on the enemy, and is a good check for game knowledge. If you know rocks can't be pierced, you'll be able to utilize them for consistent extra damage. The layouts of each floor excluding the enemies are also solid and pretty fun to go through, with there being a good deal of clever puzzles. Not to mention the theming for this cave is exceptional, and this is basically the only cave with actual proper music in it. The bread bugs themselves are pretty memorable set pieces for this cave, but yeah, they kind of just are set pieces. Now, I'm not going to say they are useless, they do definitely add a slight bit of strategy to the floor since you'll usually want to put purples onto each treasure you're carrying back, so they don't snag them, but they are far from reaching their full potential for this cave. The bread bugs have been nerfed because, I don't know, this is the same game that thinks the puffy blowhog is worthy of being an end of cave boss. They no longer have their nests, which they used to drag treasures back to, requiring for them to be killed for the treasure to come back. And if any excess Pikmin were on the object the bread bugs were carrying, those Pikmin would die. Now they just bury up objects in dirt piles, which only take a few seconds to be unearthed again. Sometimes they don't even go through the effort of burying it, they just place the object into these patches of grass, which requires 0 extra work to be done to retrieve the treasure. Not only does this make the bread bugs non-lethal, but it also kind of makes them a complete non-issue. Getting the treasure out of the nest could be kind of a pain in Pikmin 2 since the bread bugs could take a while to be killed. Pikmin 4 actually has time continue underground, though at a much slower rate, so a time consequence like that would be a very natural fit now. So this new change, which only applies an extremely minute time penalty, just feels like a pretty big downgrade and missed potential. Not to mention, for the bread bugs, basically all of the treasures in this cave are out of reach, so they can't interact with them until the player has already begun collecting the treasure and can circumvent the bread bug being able to steal them at all. The bread bugs add to the cave, but they definitely feel neutered for no real reason. Overall though, the first 4 sublevels are all pretty good, even if there's some aspects I feel could have been improved. However, it's the final floor that really seals the deal for this cave. I cannot stomach this floor at all. It's meant to be a giant bread bug fight, but the floor is absolutely fucking humongous and it overstays its welcome and then some. Doesn't help that the giant bread bug himself isn't the best. He worked well in Pikmin 2 since it was in this very condensed floor with a bunch of other enemies and bread bugs. So it was kind of a fast-paced blitz, whereas here, once you deal with the bull bear, which will likely be before you really get to see the giant bread bugs properly, it's just kind of one-on-one with the giant bread bugs in this massive floor, which is boring and just kills the pacing of the cave entirely. They're also bugged. You can try to do extra damage by having the purple Pikmin crush them like a paper bag, but throwing them on top of the giant bread bug is super finicky and it often just glitches out entirely, to the point where it should have just been cut because it doesn't work more times than it does. Even after you beat the giant bread bugs, you have to go to this whole other section that's basically just filler. The floor was already long enough. What's an end of cave boss doing here? Is this Kaizo? This floor is a stinker and drags this cave down for me. Overall though, the Plunder Palace is a pretty alright cave, though it's another one I felt didn't reach the peak of its potential, but it definitely has quite a lot of redeeming qualities. I'd say the highlight floor for me is sublevel 2, but I feel equally about every floor, bar the moldy one.
It's kinda dark. You bring a light? No.
The Sightless Passage is the other one-floor cave I mentioned earlier, and I think the gimmick here works very well. It's in the second area and alongside 3 other caves, so it does feel like a change of pace and a bit of a break from the action. The layout is also very nice. It's super open with you having many choices of where you want to go, and it keeps it fresh for replays. When some of these floors have all these different routes, it definitely feels like a much more refined version of what Pikmin 2 did with its procedural generation. I actually don't have much to say about the Sightless Passage. It's a very solid cave. Definitely a fun one to go through. If I had to complain, splitting up from Mochi is hard due to the roadblocks and stuff, and it's usually better to stay with him, which I feel contrasts the multitasking potential this layout offers. Again though, this is a pretty consistent issue throughout all of these caves. It's also worth noting you're expected to buy the headlamp in order for the cave to be properly illuminated. I don't like when the game does this. I think the upgrade shouldn't really be forced upon you, but the cave is early enough into the area so you aren't getting blindsided by it. There is a far more egregious example of this that we'll get to soon, but it is a slight annoyance here, though it doesn't matter for replays and it didn't really impact its ranking. Overall though, I'm quite fond of the Sightless Passage.
Smell you! Get off! Hey, get out! Go!
The Mud Pit is a cave that starts off strong. Theming wise, I really like this one. It is technically just the aquarium theme but with darker lighting and mud instead of water, but it looks very unique and is a clever asset flip. It doesn't take much to shake up recycled assets, and I think this cave is a good example of that. It has an identity of its own, and it would be disingenuous to write it off as a rehash. Mud is also a really cool hazard, and it's used very well in this cave. The first 2 floors also have some really strong layouts and pretty good enemy encounters, especially with the bog swallow, who can be quite a pain, especially when paired with stuff like the water dumples. I actually feel pretty equally about these first 2 floors, but I'd say the highlight for me is sublevel 2. But I can honestly swap between them, they're both very well made. Now, I did say the cave started off strong, but what happens after the second floor? Does it fall off in quality? No, it just fucking ends. We've reached the caves I'm basically fully fond of, and my most frequent complaint from here on out is that when I'm actually enjoying a cave, it just gets fucking pulled off stage with a hook. This cave is only 3 sublevels long, last one being a boss encounter, so you're really only getting 2 floors to flesh out the concept this cave has, which simply is not enough. I mentioned earlier that time still passes underground at a much slower race, and this was a really short-sighted and frankly poor decision. It was an attempt to compromise with people who did not enjoy the gameplay of caves from Pikmin 2. Many of those people prefer the time aspects seen in Pikmin 1 and 3. It fails though, time running very slowly when you're underground at 1/6 of the time didn't magically make these caves just like the gameplay from 1 and 3. They're still caves. This probably just made them even more intrusive for people who didn't like them, as they're cutting into the traditional time-based gameplay even more now. And for the people who like caves, this sucks because it's pretty intrusive for the cave gameplay, and the floors aren't really built with this time thing in mind. The biggest impact it has is shortening the caves to all hell. There's a plethora of caves that don't get off the ground properly since they are made too short to accommodate this time-passing underground system. Occasionally in Pikmin 2, you actually would get a more time-based element in caves, such as the bread bugs, enemies that revive and have to be carried back to the ship, and most well known, the water wraith. It wasn't particularly common in Pikmin 2, and I definitely would not have been opposed to seeing it get fleshed out further. Making time pass underground is just the lazy way of adding time-based elements to caves. You get punished for slowing down to think about how to handle a certain situation or enemy interaction, which is what you're meant to be doing. It's just straight up nonsense. I'm surprised it isn't seen in the same vein as stuff like the tree-type limus. The reason I'm only bringing this up now is because we'll be seeing some caves with some truly great floors that had a lot of potential to be highlight caves of the game, but they end up getting completely kneecapped by a poor design decision that benefits nobody. These 2 floors are good, but you do not get a full package here, and this cave ends way too soon. Not helping matters is this cave doesn't exactly end with a bang, instead ending with a fight against the bug-eyed Crawmad. A boss you've already fought, not once, but twice in the previous area. He's not even a hard boss, he shouldn't even be a post-game boss in the first place. And I'm not letting it slide that the original way this floor went is that you freeze the pool of mud so the boss is defenseless, and you just win. You can still do this in fierce mode, but there's at least a bit more to it, since if you go with the default layouts, you have to lose 0 ice Pikmin at all to pull this off. But if you do that, or simply just bring extras, you can just skip this fight entirely. Even if you don't, it's the bug-eyed Crawmad who's a super easy boss, and you've already fought him twice not too long before this. This wouldn't be the worst, but due to the cave's length, this is 1/3 of the entire cave and is an absolute waste. Overall, I like the mud pit, but it definitely needed more floors, and if it had more floors that were in a similar vein to the first 2, I'd probably just be solely singing my praises about this one instead of lamenting for a longer cave. As it stands, it ends before it truly gets off the ground and explores the setting of this cave to its fullest potential.
Hey, I've seen this one. This is a classic.
What do you mean you've seen this? It's brand new.
The Frozen Inferno is a cave I mentioned much earlier when talking about the Subzero sauna, and as I said there, they're identical. It basically feels like they had one ice cave, but then just divorced them into 2 separate caves, and neither of them really benefited from it. In fact, scripting this section was difficult because it felt like I was repeating myself, and I basically was. I do feel the floors here are generally better than the Subzero sauna, and those were already pretty good. The highlight floor for me is sublevel 4, which has the fight against the Snowfake Fluttertail, a very fun boss that utilizes the fire starter as well. which this cave prominently uses and introduces here. These are probably one of the best additions to Pikmin 4. They give red Pikmin a neat use and also interact with the level environments in a clever way. The main drawbacks of this cave is it feels uninspired due to you playing a cave that is nearly identical to it beforehand, and neither of these caves feel like they are fully fleshing out the concept due to their short length. This could have been easily solved by just having them be in one cave. It would only be 7 sublevels, which is a fair length, and you'd circumvent all the issues I just mentioned. It also has the gimmick of letting you only bring red Pikmin inside the cave, though you do quickly get ice and rocks, so it's not the biggest deal. It also completely refuses entry into the cave if you don't have the fire-resistant gear for both the Captain and Ochi. This is just annoying and way more egregious than the headlamp one for the Sightless passage because you just straight up can't enter the cave. Not to mention this cave is at the end of the map. I'd been stung by this before since I didn't know Ochi needed it too, so my pretty decent run of the game was set back by a day since I had basically already done everything else here. And all of this just because it wouldn't make sense for the Captain to jump in a stove? Okay. Was the game made by CinemaSins? I don't think it'd really be noticeable, and I doubt it'd ruin immersion, and we're in the hero's hideaway. There wasn't much immersion to be had here in the first place. Didn't affect the ranking much, I just think it's annoying gameplay-wise. Overall though, it's a fun enough cave, it just didn't really reach its full potential, due to the divorce.
That's it? That's the last episode?
The Cradle of the Beast is truly tragic. I love these first 2 floors, they have some frankly impeccable design. Sublevel 1 makes great use of the fire starters with some pretty neat enemy layouts alongside us. I like that there's water geysers here that serve as hazards, yet if you think outside the box you can use them to extinguish the fiery bullblacks, thus making dealing with him easier. That's great level design. The highlight floor is Sublevel 2, which is also consistently great and one of the few that has you sped up from Ochi, and it works wonders, along with even better enemy layouts than the last floor. This is an ethereal experience to go through and is on track to be one of the best caves in the game, and it's gone. It's gone. It ends after 3 sublevels. Why? I really like this one and they just cut it off. It doesn't even make sense because it's in the 5th area which only has 3 caves total. One of those is 1 floor long and the other one is shit, so this one didn't have to be so short, and just like the mud pit, it feels like it doesn't get off the ground, and I leave this one feeling unsatisfied. It felt like I played the demo of the cave, not the full thing. At least the boss, which is the Empress Bullblacks rematch, is an actually fun fight and is a decent challenge. It does make sense for this to be the boss to cap off the cave. But the issue is we put the cap on too soon. If this had more floors in a similar vein to the first 2, it would have probably been a top 3 cave frankly, but I can't rank it highly because the full package is just too short to feel complete, despite how good those 2 floors are. The Secluded Courtyard is definitely a cave that was elevated by Fierce Mode. I said in my initial review of the update that Fierce Mode feels less like a hard mode and more like the way the game was always meant to be, and that definitely rings true for this cave. Beforehand, this would probably be in the pilot caves that were kinda whatever, but I feel Fierce Mode makes this a very cohesive cave. The theming here is lovely. There's the obvious fact that it's based off of a Japanese dry garden, also known as a Zen garden, and has a very unique and standout theme aesthetically, and it looks very pleasant. Then there's the theming with the enemies themselves, which is mimicry. Both types of skitterleaves, the dweevils that disguise themselves by carrying objects, the sun squish, and the boss of the cave, the Fulix. It hones in on a specific set of enemies and uses them all effectively. The Sun Squish is a surprisingly threatening enemy and it can pop out of eggs too, adding a bit of risk and reward to each egg you open up. There's also this section with the dweevils that I like on floor 2. There's a bunch of them to deal with and you can utilize various tactics like distracting them with items you aren't going to collect. The layouts of each floor also allow for pretty effective multitasking and splitting up between captains, especially because Ochi doesn't have huge benefits against any specific enemies here. The highlight floor for me is sublevel 4, which is the fight against the Fulix. Not really the toughest boss, but it is a fun fight. The cave overall isn't the toughest as it is early enough in the game, but it does offer a fair challenge, and has inventive scenarios with the enemies it uses. Some people assume that when Pikmin 4 gets criticized for its lack of difficulty, it's just because the critics want the game to look like a Pikmin 2 Kaizo ROM hack. But that's not the case at all. Neither Pikmin 1 or 2 were ever that hard, but they offered a challenge and weren't frictionless. This cave isn't that hard, but it does offer a challenge with friction, which is engaging. Most people just don't like when there is no friction and you can just nuke everything in a second with a dog, because that's just not fun. This cave is only 4 sublevels long, but considering it's the first cave in the second area, I think it's a pretty appropriate length, and it does feel like it fully accomplished what it set out to do. Overall, I like this cave.
Oh my god, yucky bugs!
The Subterranean Swarm can be a bit of a forgettable one, but it is definitely one of the better caves in this game. It'll usually be the last cave you face right before the grand finale, and in that sense, it is kind of underwhelming. It's only 5 sublevels long, and while the floor layouts are all well thought out and all, it doesn't really feel like a late game cave, and feels a bit more suited for the mid game. But still, there aren't really any bad or whatever floors here, they're all good. The first floor is neat because it uses the grub chuckers, but you don't actually have to fight them since they are mostly harmless, and don't have the treasures. But they still serve as imposing obstacles, and being able to avoid them feels like you are being awarded for proper game knowledge. It's a floor that holds up very well for repeat playthroughs. The highlight floor for me is sublevel 2, which utilizes the cannon larva in a pretty interesting way, and has some pretty cool looking set pieces along with us, making this a very memorable floor. This cave also has a bit of a similar issue to the mud pit, where the boss of the cave is a boss you fought in the previous area. It's not quite as bad because the boss is the Sovereign Bullblacks, which is generally a far better fight than the Bug-Eyed Crawmad, and there is at least a new gimmick here where he drops boulders from the ceiling. I also like the fact that there's a Doodlebug who drops bomb rocks on the floor prior, and if you put 2 and 2 together, you get an advantage for this fight. That's very clever design. There's also a refight with the Horned Cannonbeal, which honestly just felt unnecessary. It's not a very interesting refight, and the cave is a bit too short to have a mid-boss in my opinion. It's definitely a bit brief for its own good, especially since 2 of the floors are boss floors, but it's a pretty good cave overall. The Seafloor Resource. So this one's interesting because if this was pre-update Pikmin 4, this cave would definitely be near the bottom. It used to be a prime example of lame enemy layouts. Fiery blowhogs all on their own, and they just immediately get nuked by Ochi and the Ice Pikmin. However, a few tweaks that Fierce Mode made flipped this cave on its head, and it ended up being one of my favorite caves now, which is definitely surprising. Fire was changed in Fierce Mode to basically be insta-killed for Ice Pikmin, and this definitely changes a lot for this cave, since now you have to be a lot more careful with how you use Ice Pikmin, and it turns what used to be extremely underwhelming enemy encounters into far more thoughtful ones. You could use Ice Pikmin to deal with these enemies quicker, but it could potentially backfire severely, and you have to be pretty cautious with how you use your Ice Pikmin now, even if you're not in combat. This feels like it was the original vision for the cave because it feels way too deliberate not to be. Either they dialed back on Fire's kill timer when making the original game, or they thought that Ice Pikmin dying in 4 seconds instead of 6 was super punishing. Probably the case considering the game we're dealing with here. The peckish aristo crabs are also a pretty big threat now, and they used to be a complete joke, so that also adds to the cave. The improved enemy interactions have made me appreciate the actual design of each floor in this cave. There's a good amount of stuff going on here, and while it originally lacked the sauce to really be engaging, proper enemy interactions really make this cave click. I don't think it's perfect though. Treasure bloat is kind of a reoccurring issue in this game. You'll occasionally get a floor littered with treasures, with most of said treasure basically just being rubbish, which requires no challenge to guess. This cave has a bit of that, and also the most egregious example of this. You'll get a section with a bunch of small treasures where there really didn't need to be that many. Then on sublevel 2 you have to straight up leave the level just so you can collect 2 treasures that are in the background and are super easy to miss. What kind of Mario Odyssey bullshit is this? Just put those treasures in the level. The boss of the cave is also the Master Hop, a pretty lame one. Also one of those instances where it feels like the developers forgot you spend most of this game with your squad on the industry plant dog, and not spread out on the floor. The rest of the cave though is good enough to outweigh the negatives. It also has great theming and visuals. It's like the Fruitager Oreo aesthetic vibe core pro ship, or whatever the kids say nowadays. Overall, this is a pretty good cave. I'd say the highlight floor for me is sublevel 3. I like how it's split up in half, and you get some pretty good enemy interactions. Though this is another one where I feel equally about all of the non-boss floors.
Remember addicts? Remember Ghostbusters? Oh, I remember.
Surprisingly, reaching the top tree, we have leaves. Okay, no, we have the Engulfed Castle, which I'm surprised it got this high because the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of this cave is a bunch of complaints. Pikmin 4 has quite a lot of fan service, and the Engulfed Castle is probably the most blatant example of this. If you couldn't tell from the name, this is based off of the Submerged Castle, and I mean that in James Somerton terms. This is essentially just a rehash of the Submerged Castle. You have to deal with the Water Wraith again, and the layouts are often identical to the ones found in Pikmin 2. It's cheap to say the least, and is very clearly trying to bank off of nostalgia points. It ends up shooting itself in the foot because this cave is kind of forgettable because you will always be thinking about the submerged castle instead, and it doesn't really have an identity of its own. Not to mention, it definitely pales in comparison to the original. The water wraith is basically a non-issue now. He still runs off of a 5-minute timer just like in Pikmin 2, but the issue is you move and carry things way faster than you did in Pikmin 2. So you naturally get through these floors way faster. I don't think I even encountered the water wraith on my very first time playing Pikmin 4, which isn't really a good thing. Not to mention, the wraith himself has been nerfed, moving much slower and having worse AI. Very unnecessary because he would have already been weaker since you have a fast, all-terrain vehicle on you at all times, along with the cave now having designated safe zones where he can't reach you. His existence is also just spoiled before you even get to enter the cave, which is lame. The water wraith goes from being the clear highlight of the submerged castle to probably being my least favorite part of this cave due to how disappointing and irrelevant he is. It feels like the Pikmin equivalent of the Chevy Chase show. Other things are also lost in translation. Sublevel Tree stood out in Pikmin 2 because the devs made it so that the procedural generation of that floor would basically turn it into a confusing maze. And the central threat here was electricity, which was a very big threat since it was insta-kill. In Pikmin 4, they try to copy this floor, but it doesn't work since electricity is just a really trivial hazard now that takes several seconds to kill Pikmin. Not to mention, they just removed most of the enemies with no substitutes here. There's only one Withering Blowhog now who is nowhere near the other enemies, and they removed the anode builds for zero reason. Ends up being a pretty weak floor since it just copies what Pikmin 2 did while forgetting that it's not Pikmin 2. That's the biggest issue with this cave. You're basically playing a Pikmin 2 cave that can't really be fully adjusted to some of the radical changes 4 made. Now, considering all of the issues I have with this, why is it in 3rd place? Simply put, you can only go so wrong with reheating the submerged castle. It is many people's favourite cave in the series after all, and playing a knockoff version of it is still fun. With the exception of Sublevel Tree, I think all these floors are very engaging. The highlight floor for me is Sublevel 4, which I actually think is an improvement over the original. They use the volatile larpers pretty well here, they chase after you and you can use them to crack open these mushrooms. This is also your first encounter with the Startled Spore, and I have already stated my discontent with Pikmin 4's many clone enemies in the past, but I can easily make an exception for this one because having a different variant of the Creeping Chrysanthemum is a pretty good curveball, especially when it's introduced here of all places. That's just cruel and I love it. You get some pretty good enemy interactions here overall. There's this Bulborb with some dwarves following him, which, aside from the obvious...
That's where I usually sit. Right there.
...is a good fight. Overall, it's a fun cave, but it's one I begrudgingly put in the top 3, purely because there's not much competition, and yeah, if you directly plagiarize one of the best caves in the series, it's obviously still going to be fun to play through. But considering that cave was 19 years old, and there's been a lot more introduced to the series since then, I feel like this could have been so much more. It's disappointing, all things considered. Putting it this high feels like I'm giving the medal to an athlete I knew was on steroids.
This is my kingdom come, this is my kingdom come.
The Kingdom of Beasts, similar to a few other caves in this game, is taking notes from a cave in Pikmin 2. However, I think this is the one time where I actually feel like they copied a cave and ended up making something better than what they were copying. This is based off of the Bulblax Kingdom, as evident by the name, and the boss arena being pulled from the cave too. The Bulblax Kingdom was a fairly alright cave in Pikmin 2, but I feel Pikmin 4's interpretation does certainly improve upon the concept greatly, and ends up feeling pretty unique because of this. I'd say the biggest improvement is the enemy lineup. For a cave called the Bulblax Kingdom, there wasn't too many Bulborbs, and bar the Emperor, you only faced off against the orange Bulborbs. I didn't know this was a bigoted kingdom. Here though, you face off against a wide variety of Bulborbs, and this cave generally has some of the best enemy interactions and layouts out of all these caves. For instance, you get a floor that revolves around the Bulbear's patrolling mechanic. This cave obviously was made much better with Fierce mode, since a lot of these enemies were Ochi cannon fodder beforehand, leading to what was kind of a weak cave considering it focuses a lot on combat. Now though, it's far more rounded out and ends up actually having better enemy interactions overall than the Bulblax Kingdom, as that cave also suffered from Bulborbs being cannon fodder, that time at the hands of purple Pikmin. This cave only recommends that you bring red Pikmin, and this is the only cave I can think of that actually has some squad strategy. You aren't as restricted this time. The cave has lakes of water you are meant to swim over with Ochi, but if you bring ice Pikmin, you can freeze these bodies of water and get access to shortcuts. The player has to figure this out themselves, and it feels very rewarding to do so. I have no clue how they could design layouts like that, which get better with every replay, and just go, yeah, that's good, but our loyal Pikmin fans actually hate that stuff. Please don't let it ever happen again. It doesn't happen again, unfortunately. You get the tree type limits and the game telling you exactly what to bring with no ifs or buts, and we all know how that was critically received. It's sad because every cave could have had something like this, but they chose to stifle this. Being able to plan out your squad by yourself and strategize should just be a given, not something I have to specifically compliment one cave for allowing you to do. Also, speaking of types, rock Pikmin. They're here. This is another shoehorn, but probably the least offensive shoehorn in this game. There's a few crystal walls around, and they do add a slight bit to the cave, and it's not like rocks need too much of an introduction. And in fairness, a cave that's pretty focused on combat is a good time to introduce them. Plus, they can even give you an advantage in some fights, such as the Empress Bullblacks. This is the second longest cave in the game at a whopping 6 sublevels. Definitely jarring when you first find out that the second longest cave in this game is 6 floors long and shows up in the second area. However, in isolation, 6 floors is a pretty appropriate length for this cave. Probably the one cave that has the issue of being too hard for when it shows up, at least compared to a lot of the caves that appear after and around us. But I'm not exactly inclined to complain about that, considering the level layouts are really good, and well, we've seen the contrary. The highlight floor for me is sublevel 6, where you have to face off against 2 Emperor Bullblaxes in one dense arena. Probably one of the hardest floors in the game, actually. Overall, this is a great cave and definitely one of the highlights. Well, who could have seen this one coming? The Cavern for a King is the grand finale of Pikmin 4 and is universally considered the best cave in the game, and I mean, it's not hard to see why. It's the one cave in the game that isn't ashamed to be a cave. It's a 20-floor boss rush, the longest cave in not just this game but the series, beating out the Hole of Heroes from Pikmin 2 by 5 sublevels. Speaking of the Hole of Heroes, that was my favorite cave in Pikmin 2, and this one is very similar. I'm not going to say it's copying the Hole of Heroes since Pikmin 2 did not invent the concept of boss rushes, but naturally I'm going to be receptive to a cave that's similar to my favorite one in Pikmin 2, and this one does a very good job. Each floor provides a very unique twist on the boss you're facing. Even simple and forgettable ones, such as the Arctic Cannonbeal, get a very riveting floor that really utilizes the boss and its mechanics to its fullest potential. You also face off against the final boss of the game, the Ancient Sirehound here, which a lot of people don't really seem to like, but I've actually always really enjoyed this. You also get to fight the Bloomcap Bloister, who isn't even a boss. Why are you here? Actually, they can stay because their floor is really good. They chase you and your Pikmin down. It's kind of like Pac-Man. I think my only issues with this cave stem from 2 floors. Sublevel 17 is almost good when you get used to it, but the hitbox of the Empress Bullblacks is slightly disjointed, which fucks the whole thing up considering the precision you need for it. And sublevel 16 is a refight against the Water Wraiths, which cheapens his impact when he's just showing up wherever, and let's just say there's a reason he didn't have a refight in Pikmin 2. But honestly, 2 misses out of 20 is a pretty good ratio, especially because one of those is just kinda whatever. I mean, the Dream Den shits itself constantly, and I still like it. There's a new boss here, the Toxstool, which aside from a pretty derivative design visually, has a really cool gimmick of being able to respawn downed enemies. Definitely one of the best bosses in this game, actually. I'm gonna be boring and say that the highlight floor is sublevel 20, I think the Ancient Sirehound is cool. But overall, yeah, this is clearly the best cave in this game by a large margin, and is probably one of the highlights of the game in general. Well anyways, there we have it, we've ranked every single cave in Pikmin 4. One thing I've always noticed but never really gotten why is that the caves in Pikmin 4 seem to be generally forgotten about. Aside from the Cavern for a King and occasionally the Engulfed Castle, you'd never really see specific caves mentioned or highlighted in this game. However, after doing this ranking, yeah, it's kind of easy to see why so many of these are forgotten about. So many of these caves are really short, feel pretty underbaked, and there's quite a few I'd say are straight up bad. This is on Fierce Mode 2, they were significantly weaker when the game first launched. The caves are probably the weakest part of Pikmin 4, and aside from Pikmin 2's challenge mode, I'd argue the caves in this game have probably the weakest lineup of content out of anything in the series. It feels like the caves were reluctantly added to this game because most of them kind of feel like they want to get themselves over with as soon as possible. Even the caves I liked feel really forgettable and underwhelming because of how little they are fleshed out. Anyways, this was meant to be a shorter video that I put out between other videos, and then it ended up being like an hour long. I would say leave your favorite cave in the comment section, but I think everyone's favorite is the Cavern for a King, so I don't know, just comment whatever you want to say about the caves in this game. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe, or else I'll be uploading high quality Pikmin videos bi-weekly from now on.